Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the University of Minnesota. I am Michael Rodriguez, the Dean of the College of Education and Human Development. Son from the great city of St. Paul. Happy to be here, and happy to have everybody here with us this morning. CHD, College of Education and Human Development, is an educational organization. We are in the business of preparing the world's next generation of leaders, and I often say that group of leaders will not look like the leaders that we grew up with. Whether they are in public or private schools, public agencies or organizations, or corporations. To accomplish this goal of preparing our next generation of leaders, CHD is also a learning organization. We continue to learn what it is that we do and how to do our work. And as our tagline says, we are driven to discover. And a major way that we discover is serving as a convener. CEHD is a convener. And we bring people together. We bring researchers together that are exploring and discovering new knowledge and evidence-based practices with local wisdom and local experts. The folks that have sustained communities for generations because of their own knowledge and practices. And by bringing folks together through convening, we together learn so much more. So let's get the convening and learning underway. I am happy to introduce my favorite principal and the Executive Director of Educational Leadership in CEHD, Katie Pekel.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for those kind words and introductions. For those of you that are sitting on the edges, I think maybe Ryan already asked you to do the scooch. I was a middle school principal. You know how awkward that is when somebody can't find their way from the parking garage to the auditorium. Former president of the university had a little bit of trouble this morning, too. So let's just be kind if people are coming in and they don't have a place to sit, that we're just going to scooch over and make sure that they can get in. How does that sound? Okay, so we're really, really excited to have everyone here today. Thank you for being here. Before we begin, I really need to situate why we're here today. You're here because you want to hear from Emily. We get that. We're really excited about that as well. But about a year and a half ago, I was lucky enough to get a call from Dean Rodriguez and said, could you talk to a couple of folks for me from the Higher Education Literacy Partnership? And I said, sure. Because I think what happens is when people approach Dean Rodriguez and they say, we want to do this thing and we'd like to talk to school principals, that's where he stops listening. I'm just kidding. And he says, I've got just the person for you. So I was really lucky that Susan Thompson and Chris Stern approached me, and they said, we'd like to see what we can do to support the knowledge and understanding of school leaders around literacy and specifically the science of reading. And they offered to come out to one of the sessions of a program that I run called the Minnesota Principals Academy. And I said, well, that's great, but I actually have an alumni network of about 500 people, so what if we thought a little bit bigger and could reach those folks? So after we're done with our conversation today, I'm going to be sharing with you the launch of a free professional development session, I guess, series, I would call it, that will be available to anyone across the state. And I just want to acknowledge that that's why we're here today, and a big thank you to everyone from the Higher Education Literacy Partnership who's with us today that makes sure that that happened. So let's give them a round of applause. So, a journalist, a researcher, and a practitioner walk into an auditorium. They're all experts in their fields, and those fields are really very different. So let me just quickly introduce to you probably the one who needs no introduction, Emily Hanford. Emily, as you are aware, is an award-winning journalist. She's worked in public media for more than 2 decades. We shared this morning that our kids are about the same age, yet I don't think we're very old. So 2 decades sounds like a long time.
You know what? It's actually more like 3.
Oh, we'll just say 2. We'll just go with that. Yeah.
Made us sound older.
So Emily, in 2017, she won an Excellence in Media Reporting on Education Research Award from the American Education Research Association for her groundbreaking podcast, Hard Words, Why Aren't Children Being Taught to Read? Now that is when I was originally exposed to Emily's work, it was not long after that original documentary was released. I happened to be on my morning run. I lived in St. Paul at the time, and I stopped and I said some things I wouldn't say in front of an auditorium, and then I texted about 6 of the people that I try to connect with in education, and one of them was Melissa Sonnek, and I said, "Oh my God," and she said to me, "Don't tweet." True story. Read first. So I went to my office and I said to a really fantastic student worker at the time, I said, "I just sent you a link," and it was to the script version of the documentary. I said, "At the end of it are all of the references, and I need you to print them all and bring them to me." And she came back to me and she said, "There's 49, so we're gonna go Google Drive." And I was like, but we did. So Emily has done an incredible amount of reporting, and I know you're really interested in hearing from her today. How many of you, just by show of hands, have listened to either the Sold a Story podcast or her original documentaries? Let's see that. That's good. That's going to situate us well for today, I think. So that's going to help us think about a little bit of the second panelist who's going to share some more data today about Emily and the impact of her reporting beyond my informal data gathering. All the way down on my left, your right, is Kendeou, who's a distinguished McKnight professor in the Department of Educational Psychology. She holds the Guy Bond Chair in Reading. She's the director of the Reading and Learning Lab and the co-director of the Learning Informatics Lab. Do you eat? Okay, yeah. Dr. Kendew's research focuses on language, cognition, and learning with a specialization in reading comprehension. Pani's team has actually mined the Twitter data to understand the types and impact Emily's reporting is having on the conversation about literacy on that platform. And we're going to hear more about that in just a moment, so we're eager to hear about that. Melissa Sonnek. Melissa currently serves as the assistant superintendent in the Roseville Public Schools, though her identity is that of reading teacher. Melissa took her original methods course from her own mother, a school teacher as well. She holds a master's in reading instruction. She was a classroom teacher for 10 years at kindergarten, 1st, and 3rd grade. She was a reading recovery teacher, a literacy specialist, and literacy coach. She was an elementary principal at what we might call a beat the odds school. She's taught K-6 reading methods courses in higher ed, and she is one of the best principals I have worked with in my time at the University of Minnesota. I would also say that she is one of my go-tos when I have questions about literacy and leadership. Although professionally, Melissa did grow up on Lucy Calkins, and when I first reached out to her about Emily's work shortly after Hard Words was released, let's just say Melissa had some thoughts, which we hope to get into today. So thank you all for being here. Melissa, I am going to start with you, if you don't mind. As I mentioned in this introduction, you were a teacher, and I know that you've made a bit of a journey as you understand literacy instruction. In fact, I think you've described it as I've had to unlearn some of the things that I learned. So would you maybe just share a little bit about that with us this morning to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks for the warm introduction, Katie. As you said, part of my identity is as an educator, is as a reading teacher. I taught reading as a teacher, I led professional development, and led reading implementation. And I, like many educators, had some strongly held beliefs about how we should be teaching literacy. When I started learning about the science of reading, by listening to Emily's original reporting, as Katie mentioned, like I felt some sort of way. And I pushed back hard and I disagreed. I mean, full disclosure, this is a safe space, right? Like I could share, you're not gonna think less of me. But I may or may not have yelled at Emily repeatedly in my car as I was listening to her reporting. I've apologized, we're gonna do a restorative circle later, it'll be fine. But on a more serious note, if the research was right, then what I knew about reading was no longer true. And that messed with my identity as a teacher, and more so, it meant that maybe I had underserved students that I was so profoundly proud of serving and I cared so deeply about. And even now when I say that out loud, I can feel the vulnerability in that, right? Like it just feels wobbly. And so as I wrestled with it, I started to do what I always do when I have no idea what to do. I read. And the irony of that is not lost on me, right? So as I started to read and unlearn, that's what our English Language Arts Committee did as well in Roseville area schools. So we're fortunate to be in a curriculum review process, meaning that we're going to be purchasing a new literacy curriculum. Part of that 3-year process included a literature review. So as a team, we gathered over 100 pieces of literature, and there's no shortage out there, right, of research. And we lovingly called that the big list. And we jigsawed that and then narrowed it down to the short or short-ish list that had about maybe 20 or so pieces of research, articles, podcasts, blog, everything. And we all read that. And we did that so that when we made decisions as a committee, we were working with a strong knowledge base about how students learn how to read. And what we are also finding in that is there's many things that we're getting right too. I think that this, for some teachers, can be paralyzing of like, now I'm in front of kids on Tuesday and I don't know what to do, right? So for example, our research affirmed like small group instruction is essential, but maybe we're doing it with some decodable books instead of leveled text. Or instead of word walls, maybe we have sound walls, right? So it affirmed some of the things that we were doing right and helped us to expand the story and our learning of what we needed to do next. So we're really still on this journey of learning and unlearning. We have not arrived by any means.
Thank you. I really do appreciate that, Melissa, and appreciate your willingness to share your vulnerability. Friends in the back, we're sorry about the parking at the university. Come on in, find yourself a seat. People who have open seats next to them, raise a hand, do some scooching. Let's go.
Do some scooching.
Everybody make a friend. There we go. Sorry, I was a middle school principal, so. All right, Emily, in addition to the tremendous amount of research you're able to pack into your reporting, I would actually describe it as gifted storytelling, but I don't know that journalists often like to be called storytellers, but that is really what I think you do. You seem to understand and convey kind of what Melissa was just talking about, this idea that teachers are not to blame, right? I actually have a theory, and I think that this is why your work is having some influence, because investigative reporting can be kind of harsh sometimes, and you really bring a humanizing aspect to that work. So let's talk about that work, your work. What prompted you to begin this sort of investigation into reading? And throughout this process, what has been the most surprising to you?
Sure. Well, good morning. Thank you very much for having me. I actually started this work with college students. So it was 2016, and I was reporting on remedial classes in college. And I was talking to all of these students and their instructors, their professors, about reading problems. I was at a bunch of community colleges in Connecticut primarily, and some in Maryland. And I actually met this one student who had a huge impact on me. Her name was Sarah, and there's a long story about how I found her. She had been in college many years before. She sort of got stuck in this remedial class. She was able to make it through. She became a nurse, and there was an ice storm going on in Connecticut, and I drove to her house, and she had just had a baby, and we sat there and did this hours-long interview where she told me about her reading problems. And she told me about how she had dyslexia, which I knew nothing about, not something she had ever been diagnosed with or really gotten any proper help with when she was in school. And she just sort of told me how she got through life without really being able to read or spell. And this was amazing to me because it is not something that I ever thought about before. I learned to read pretty easily. I have 2 children. I think they learned to read pretty easily. Even though I've been an education reporter for a very long time, it's not really something I'd ever thought about. So the journey actually started with dyslexia. I was just sort of interested in that. What is that? What's up with that? Why aren't kids getting the help they need in school? Because that was what I found out really quickly. And that really led me meeting a lot of parents first, and then starting to really talk to a lot of teachers. I started to understand that there was this more profound problem, which is a lot of kids really weren't being taught how to read in school. And this is having the most devastating impact on kids with dyslexia because they're the ones who most need instruction and an intense amount of it. But it turns out that really all kids benefit from instruction. A lot of kids need more instruction than they're getting in school. And it really became clear to me what an equity issue this was, because I was talking to parents who were seeing that their kids were struggling in school with reading. And if you notice that your kid is struggling, and not all parents do, because of some of what they're told by schools that they're fine and everything's going to be fine and they're on level and the kids are really struggling. But if the parents recognize it, they will do anything and everything to fix that problem. And if they have time and especially money, they will use their time and their money to fix that problem. And what's happening is that kids with parents who have checkbooks are usually at the end of the day getting taught to read in ways that help them become better readers. And kids who don't aren't in many cases. They're very lucky in many of the schools that many of you probably teach in to get good intervention, to get good help, but in many cases they're not. So that's where it started, and I guess going on 6 years later, I'm still doing it, which is weird. I never thought that would be the case.
Well, I have to say, when I heard your first documentary, I didn't really anticipate that it would sort of take off into other places outside of just sort of us in education. So I want to turn to my colleague Pani, who does some really incredible research, more than just mine Twitter data. And we'll talk about that later. But she has done that. And Pani, we know that we sort of colloquially say, well, it takes a long time for research to get to practice, right? And there's actually some research on that, believe it or not, because we love to study stuff here, that gap is actually about 17 years. And so I'm interested to know, Pani, first of all, would love it if you could share some of the data that came out of your Twitter mining study. And then once you're done with that, I'd also just love for you to reflect a little bit on why you think that might be. Why do we have this sort of large research to practice gap? For example, the National Reading Panel's report was released in 2000. So 23 years ago, and now we're really talking about that. So Pani, do you mind if sharing a few of your slides? Folks in the back, you're going to help me out with that? There we go.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here today. This is a team effort.
1 second. I don't think Pani's mic is on. Oh.
You see the thing?
We're driven to discover how to help.
All right.
Thanks, Emily.
Academics.
It's okay. That's all right. You're a PhD researcher, we know.
Well, thank you. Thank you for organizing and everyone for being here today. Like Melissa mentioned, and you mentioned, when we first encountered the reporting, I mean, we all had all sorts of reactions, right? So in the academic world is not an exception to that. And we've been looking at the discourse in our institutions, in our conferences, but also a lot of that discourse unfolds in public spaces like social media, specifically Twitter. And we're very data-driven, right? We want to know, okay, is our perception right? Are things happening? Is there an impact? So we mine Twitter data, thanks to Hei Jin Huang, who is in our audience, and Laura Allen, who know how to do these things. I'm just a messenger. So we set up a point. The midpoint was when your seminal reporting came out with the lost of words.
Hard words, I think, 2018, yeah.
2018.
It's very confusing because we put words in all of the titles. Not a good idea, maybe.
Sometime in September. So we set up that midpoint, and then we went back 3 years before and 3 years after, right? We mined all of that Twitter data. You can see, I mean, it's quite a lot, right? More than 100,000 tweets and more than 25,000 unique users engaging in this conversation. And we're looking for science of reading and related words. And look at that, Emily. So slowly but surely,
Yes, we should clap for that.
the conversation intensifies, right? It starts right there. I mean, it's picking up a little bit before, as you mentioned. I mean, since 2016, you've been doing quite a bit of reporting, but soon after, slowly but surely, it's picking up. So this is kind of the intensity of the conversation. And of course, it's one medium, it's Twitter, right? Not everything happens in Twitter, but that's what we're looking at. Another interesting question for us was, what's the nature of the conversation? So what are people talking about, right? And you can see before that time point, I mean, we do have reference on the science of reading and balanced literacy and structural literacy. If those terms mean something to you. They have to do with approaches to teaching reading, right? Dyslexia and literacy. And look at what happened after, right? In intensified discussions around the science of reading and even on acronym trending and structural literacy, and dyslexia. And we see some other approaches that tend to be present before not being discussed as much. The sentiment, and this is a big one, right? I've been hearing a lot, the discourse is divisive and people are engaging in fruitful conversations. Yes, the discourse has been emotionally charged before, right? You can see, actually it was more extreme before. On the vertical axis here, you can see, those are the extremes, like emotionally negative words on the low end and emotionally positive words on the high end. It has been very variable and emotionally charged before. And since the reporting, I mean, there are emotions, but we are trending towards the very healthy, what we would call neutralization, right? We began to understand each other and to have very constructive conversations about that in terms of the emotional words that we use. And finally, something about the key players. I mean, there are many ways in which you can look at this. These are like the top users in terms of how much they talk about the science of reading in relation also to their followers, right? So they're looking of how much reach do you have. What is not represented there is who is mentioned the most. And you can guess who is mentioned the most. That would be Emily Hanford. About maybe 3,000 mentions that we've seen in this corpus. And
Even my mother-in-law occasionally texts me and says, "Are you okay?"
There you go. Just to note that the second most mentioned is actually the Reading League, and it's like at 1,500, so it's not even close. So quite a bit of mention of Emily Hanford and her work. But we can see some shift here, right, in terms of the before and after. But I do want to highlight what Emily also said about mothers. Mothers advocates for their children. They were there before, they're there after. They do want us to do the right thing and teach their kids how to read.
Thank you for this. There will be an article that will be forthcoming on this topic, and when it is out, we'll make sure that we get it up onto the website that I'm going to share with you in just a little bit. At this point, though, Pani, can I ask you maybe just to give your thoughts on maybe why, probably it doesn't come as great comfort to you as a researcher, but why we see this gap and why it takes a long time maybe to get it, get work like yours and others to practice?
That is a great question, and it's a hard one, right, for academics and for researchers to grapple with. Like in all of our papers, those last few paragraphs are about implications for practice and policy implications. And here we are, since 2019, about 27 states have enacted some kind of legislation requiring evidence-based instruction for their kids. We were not able to get to that for the last 30 plus years with a lot of advancement that we have offered in the context of the science of reading. So science communication is definitely key. I think what we have seen in our work here is that we may have witnessed science communication at its best in terms of having a kind of impact. Why are we not successful above and beyond science communication? There is also another issue that I want to bring up, and it has to do with us researchers developing the innovations, developing the curriculum, the approaches, the interventions. I mean, we're in an R1 institution, that's what we do. But then there is that extra mile that needs to happen for that innovation, for that approach to make it into the classroom at scale. And we need you, like we need you, Melissa. We need to work with you to be able to do that, to examine those innovations in the classroom at scale. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to have the evidence that our states need to actually get that work in the classroom to benefit our kids. That's the part that I feel is the most difficult. And we have an amazing dean and leadership who are working to create that infrastructure to allow us to speed up that process. How do we get from developing those innovations and having them in the classroom with the evidence, right, to go with it? Because if we were looking at evidence, the reporting that Emily has done, I mean, we would have seen that the evidence is not there, right? So now that we know to be looking for evidence, let's help create that evidence, work together, that shared responsibility of doing the work together.
Good, thank you. Opportunity for you to help create that evidence with Pani coming later. I want to come back to you, Emily, for a moment. And actually, I'm going to be interested to hear everyone's take on this and get your perspective on this next question, or perhaps better situated critique regarding Emily's work and the science of reading itself. First, though, I'm going to use an analogy that Tim Shanahan, a professor emeritus at University of Illinois Chicago and was in charge of reading for the Chicago Public Schools for a number of years. He just wrote a blog post, if you haven't read it yet, Is Emily Hanford Right? Right? So I bet you really enjoyed that. Anyways. But he does have what I think is a nice analogy to sort of lay to rest the critique that, and trust me, I've heard it many a time, she's not a teacher, she's not a researcher, she's a journalist. Yes. And what Tim Shanahan says is the idea that reporters can't report on education unless they have taught in schools or possess a PhD strikes me as odd. It's akin to the idea that Woodward and Bernstein couldn't cover Watergate since they had never been elected president. Must be nice to be compared to Woodward and Bernstein, though, right? So, just so Emily's aware she's not a teacher. So. There are some critiques, though, and I'm going to list just a few, and then would love to hear your thoughts on them. Things like reading is more than just phonics. Didactic phonics instruction will not lead to comprehension or a love of reading. And what about the argument, and I would say an equally important need for culturally responsiveness and affirming instruction for students who have been marginalized in many, many schools. So maybe I'll start with you, Melissa.
Sure, I'll address the last one,
Okay.
just about the culturally responsive teaching, because I once heard that all teaching is culturally responsive. It's just a matter of who it's culturally responsive to. And historically, in education, our teaching has advantaged white students and disadvantaged students of color. And I think we also have to define what we mean when we say culturally responsive. I think if we polled the folks in this room right now, we may get many different variations. So a working definition, according to Khalifa, Gooden, and Davis, is culturally responsive teaching signifies actions school leaders and teachers take to create school context and curriculum that responds effectively to the educational, social, political, and cultural needs of students, right? That's a very academic definition. So then what does it look like in a school on a Tuesday, to steal one of Katie's phrases? So in Roseville, we use what's called the Educational Equity Curriculum and Instructional Compass. We call it the Compass, and it's really got 4 parts. 1 is equity pedagogy, so that's how we teach. 2 is culturally relevant content, so that's absent narratives, representation. Then it also includes a social justice orientation and collective knowledge creation. So to go back to your question, yes, do we need culturally affirming materials and responsive pedagogical approaches? Absolutely. But, and if you have tuned me out this entire time and checked your emails, come back for this sentence, right? Every student must know how to decode words. Every student must know how to decode words in order to unlock the rich reading that will lead to learning. And what I worry about is that teachers across the state of Minnesota who look a lot like me, white middle-aged ladies, right? That we will
We're
use-
middle-aged now?
We are.
Okay.
I know I struggled with that, and I'm like, I think
Great.
it's true, though. I think it's true.
It's great.
But what I worry about is we'll use the argument that the science of reading or letters is not culturally responsive, and therefore not change how we are teaching. And thank you, I appreciate the clap. I'll validate it. So if you're an educator here today, and this is something that you are wrestling with, I will bring you back to what I bring myself back to every time that I feel the need to yell at Emily in my car again, every time I start to resist. And it's the Dr. Phil question. And I'm gonna warn you, somebody once said to me, it's kind of an asshole question, so if you wanna soften it up when you ask yourself, that's fine. I'm okay asking me snarky questions. But the question is, and how's that working for you? And that's what I just can't negotiate, because in Minnesota, 48% of our students are proficient readers by 3rd grade, according to our own state assessment, right? 28% of our Black students in our state are reading at grade level. And so the piece that I just can't argue is the results. And the same holds true for much of Emily's research findings. She's not wrong.
So I just want to echo, yeah, go ahead, clap for Melissa. That's
Thank you, I appreciate that.
So this isn't a critique, I think I've certainly heard before. And I just want to say I picked up the phone and called someone that I thought had a little bit of experience in this space of education in Minnesota in a while. So I called my colleague and friend, Dr. Bernadette Johnson, who happens to be in the audience today, who's a graduate of the University of Minnesota, professor at Mankato State. And I said, Bernadette, let me run this by you. And I shared a little bit about this sort of critique with her, and she said, oh, dear Katie, I need those babies to read. That means they need to decode. And I was like, okay, thanks, Bernadette, good talk. So I appreciate your sentiments, and not to upstage you with Dr. Johnson, but she's been at it a little. She's just above middle age.
Just above.
Just a little bit. Emily or Pani, what do you think about these critiques, maybe around the idea of it's not just phonics, or what about the love of reading? So,
well, of course it's not just phonics. I mean, I think one of the things that I've been, well, let me start here. It's lovely to be compared to Woodward and Bernstein. I'm actually really not, I haven't really thought of myself as an investigative reporter. It's not really what I have been. I was making radio documentaries and doing really what I would call as explanatory journalism. Yeah. And when I got into this, that's actually what I was seeking to do. I had all these ahas like, oh, that's how people learn how to read. I wanted to explain that in basic terms. And decoding turns out to be this absolutely critical element of it. And in many things, if you've only listened to Sold a Story, I hope you'll go back and listen to some of the earlier pieces, because I think I actually spend more time explaining how people learn how to read and the role of decoding in that. Sold a Story sort of was about a bunch of other things, and we did try to explain some stuff about how people learn to read and why some of the things we were kind of investigating in Sold a Story mattered. But I've written about this in the New York Times too. There's this very simple equation called the simple view of reading, and people push back because they're like, reading's not simple. And no, the simple view of reading does not say reading is simple. It's a simple way to explain a very complex process, and it's that reading comprehension, which everyone agrees is the goal, that's ultimately what the point of teaching first graders how to read is, and reading comprehension is the product of two things. So one is your ability to read the words, your decoding ability, ultimately, although you don't have to decode words after you know what they are, you're not decoding them forever, and your language comprehension. And so it's a product of those two things. So if you're weak on either side, you're going to be weak in reading comprehension. So language comprehension is a gigantic part of it. The thing is, kids come into school with a lot of language comprehension. There are differences, which is one of the reasons why we have differences that tend to correlate with family background and access to knowledge and books. But kids come into school with some language comprehension, and the thing that all kindergartners and first graders need to learn how to do, with some exceptions, some kids come into school already knowing how to decode, and in some cases their parents have taught them how to do it because they want to make sure they know before they go to school. But what they really don't know how to do is read the written words. And that's what a focus of instruction needs to be if ultimately the goal is to get to reading comprehension. You've got to help kids learn how to decode those words. Language comprehension is absolutely critical, and if your language comprehension becomes sort of a ceiling ultimately on your reading comprehension ability. But if you teach kids how to decode the words, they have access to gaining more on the language comprehension side, because ultimately the way that most of us learn the words and the stuff that we know is through reading. Mm-hmm. And so when we read the words is how we increase our language comprehension ability.
So Pani, you study comprehension. Tell us a little bit of your perspective and your thoughts on some of the critiques as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the simple view of reading, because my perception also from your reporting was that you were not leaving comprehension behind or any other component. And you were making like the strong case that we do need to teach kids how to read. So break the code, build that decoding ability. But it's also true that those two sets of skills develop concurrently and they feed each other, right? And we cannot ignore them. So early on, we need to be working on both. So it makes sense, kindergarten, we start, intensively to teach those, phonics and get into decoding, and at the same time continue to work with comprehension, because they definitely feed each other. And we don't want to be in a position where we get, in grade 4 and grade 8, and you have kids who are fluent in decoding, and then you ask them at the end, what is this text about? And they don't have much to say. So that, dual focus early on is really important. And I appreciate the difficulty, right? Mm-hmm. I've been a teacher myself. I had 30 wonderful kids in the classroom, and being able to do it all, it's challenging. So we need to provide tools and solutions to our teachers to help them do it all, because all of it is needed.
Thank you for that. So Emily, Pani, of course, is a researcher. She gave us some insights into the research, as your work has really done as well. Your work really, though, did have to take the complex and make it simple for folks to really access and understand. And you read a lot to get there. As a matter of fact, I think Hard Words I mentioned had something like 49 citations. And amongst the 4, I refer to them as documentaries. I didn't really see them as a podcast, but I think maybe some consider them a podcast. Across those 4 podcasts, there are actually, I counted them, 184 citations or references. That's a lot more than my dissertation had, I'm just going to say. So we'll be giving you a free doctorate by the time.
I'll take it.
Can you sign that? Thank you.
I stopped at a bachelor's.
So knowing that your reporting had to take the very complex and make it digestible, were there things that maybe you had to leave out, or things that you are like, well, that was going to be hard to get across?
I mean, of course, and it's my editor is a huge part of all of this. It's a back and forth, and I remember we decided to try to describe orthographic mapping, and she was like, "Do we have to say that?" and if you'll notice, actually, so I won that battle, and we did say it, and we explained it. But in Sold a Story, again, she's like, "Do we really have to say that?" And we didn't. We actually explained the process, and we didn't say it. That use the term. So yes, there are things you need to leave out, and writing as a journalist, and writing for a general audience, and especially making audio. This is a particular challenge with audio, because you're not reading when you're listening, and and actually all the research on reading shows that we actually skip around a lot when we're reading. We go back, we look at things, we forget the name of this, we go back to the top of the article or the beginning of the chapter. You don't want to do that on audio, because you just lose someone. Mm-hmm. They just start to space out, And so it's very difficult, and one of the things that we're trying very hard to do is explain complex things in a simple way and also explain it to audiences that are coming with a wide variety of backgrounds. So I know that I want to make this something that you all get something from, and you're all experts in this area. And the brand new teacher who doesn't know anything about it, and the mom who's just discovered she has a struggling reader. So yeah, of course we leave things out, but it's just, it's the art and science and craft of doing it. And I should have brought a picture, actually. It's on my phone, of the number of drafts of, I cleaned my office recently, but we had stacks of the number of drafts of every episode of Sold a Story, and they had like height to them. You know, like we wrote and rewrote that thing for a year.
That is amazing. Thank you for sharing that with us. In preparation for today, I actually solicited questions and wonderings from a pretty broad audience, mostly through my networks to school leaders, but then asked them to also inquire with educators as well. And not surprisingly, most of the responses and questions I got back really coalesced around this how question, which I was like, well, she's the reporter, remember? So anyways, so they really were things like, how do schools make changes? Where has it been done well? Are there any lessons learned? Or what about teacher education? Should we have more of a focus there? Or what can parents do when they have concerns? Or how should they advocate? So I'm gonna pose these questions. I know you, of course, are a reporter. You might have some thoughts on the how questions. And then I'm also going to turn to Melissa, because I think what they're doing in Roseville does respond to some of these how questions. So
I'll say a couple things, but I'm most interested in what Melissa has to say, and I think most of you would be too. I mean, you know, in terms of the how and what I've seen as a reporter, I mean, I get a lot of emails from teachers. And I get a lot of emails from teachers who feel like they're the only one, you know, like questioning this and trying to figure this out. And what I say is find the other teachers who are, because at this point there are other teachers, and you have to find your other people. And I say the exact same thing to parents. Parents feel really alone. The parents of struggling readers feel really alone. And I was like, there are many more of you out there, and just find them. And to all the administrators in the room, you know, when these groups of teachers and parents come to you, you know, listen, take a deep breath and listen. They're talking about something very real and, you know, problems that they really need you to help, you to fix, you to really take the lead on fixing. But you have many more of the how answers than I do.
Yeah, I can dive in.
yes, please.
So in Roseville, our vision is quality teaching and learning for all, equity in all we do. And we have really embraced this as reading is the social justice issue of our time. And so I think you guys are so kind.
They like you. I haven't gotten a clap yet.
I told Katie this was a dangerous question for me though, because I was like, do I have the full 90 minutes just to talk about this, right? So I will try to just highlight maybe 3 or 4 things that we are doing in Roseville to approach that systematic change. And the first step is to normalize emotions. And I don't think that that's always intuitive for us as educators, but I once read a quote that leaders must either invest a reasonable amount of time attending to fears and feelings, or squander an unreasonable amount of time trying to manage ineffective and unproductive behavior. And if we don't normalize the emotional journey that our teachers may experience as they navigate this and they feel alone, right? We're gonna meet a lot of resistance. And what resistance really is in most cases is fear. And so if I'm in your shoes right now, I'm like, okay, that sounds really good in theory, but then how do you do that? What does that look like? For us, we're doing some work with Coaching for Equity. And so I don't want to oversimplify transformational coaching, but there really are 4 steps that come with that. The first is to surface the reality. The second is to recognize the impact. Next is explore emotions, and then create new practices. So navigating emotions of educators is going to be an important part of this process.
Can I just ask a question there? So this is interesting, because folks who have ever worked with me in the Principals Academy know that I like to sort of harp on the idea of the seminal research on how people learn. And what I think we oftentimes do in K-12 is we just skip over, I think, the first 3 parts of what you were kind of talking about there, and we go to, we're doing this, come to the PD on Thursday, in 30 minutes you're gonna know how to do it, and then go and do it, right? And you talked about the idea of normalizing the emotions, and what the National Research Council says is that, people learn by having their preconceptions engaged, being given a conceptual framework to which they can attach new information, retrieve it, and being given an opportunity for metacognition. They have to think about their thinking, right? That those things have to take place. So if we think about the ways that we've I'm speaking of principals like myself, have just told teachers what to do without that engaging of conceptions, or what about the emotions? I wasn't good at the
Normalize
emotions.
emotions,
Yeah,
yes.
I'm really not as good at the emotional stuff, but it's a good thing you are. Why are people laughing?
I think preconceptions are also incredibly important when we're navigating how we teach reading, because teachers come to us with preconceptions and in some cases misconceptions about how children might learn to read.
Yeah.
Right? So I highly recommend looking into the 3 main findings around how people read. National Research Council?
Yeah, the National Research Council.
Like I said, like a question?
It's okay.
All right.
Thank you for reaffirming my question. But
I think another essential step for educators is learning about the science of reading. This is not a problem. So many of you are probably administrators, right? So you're principals, superintendents, and sometimes in leadership we like to manage our way out of problems. This is not a problem we can manage our way out of. We have to learn our way out of this problem. And so that's why in Roseville we're using our ESSER funds to train all of our educators in letters. When I say all, I want to tell you who that includes. For us, that's all of our K-4 classroom teachers, our pre-K teachers, our teachers of multilingual learners, special education teachers, elementary principals, and district administrators, including myself. So I think in order for our kids, in order for us to be who our kids need us to be, then we need to set down some of our tools, and we might need to admit that the facts may have changed, and that once was right may now be wrong. And I don't see a path to getting there without learning. Another piece that I already touched on is we are fortunate to be in a curriculum review process. It's a 3-year cycle, and we will be purchasing a new curriculum. That curriculum will have a strong focus, especially in our primary grades in phonics and phonemic awareness. Also, we will have a knowledge-based curriculum, which is something we've talked less about today, but it's also important. If you're interested in learning more about that, I highly suggest Natalie Wexler's book, The Knowledge Gap. So often we teach kids strategies. We're going to predict, we're going to infer, we're going to ask questions, but they don't have knowledge to hook those strategies onto. So it's important that we're providing a knowledge base as well. In addition to our Tier 1 curriculum, we're also in the process of systematizing our MTSS, so multiple tiered system of support, because we know that Tier 1 instruction is not going to meet all of the needs of all of our readers. And the last thing I'll say in terms of systematic change is we need to develop our instructional leaders. We need our principals to have extensive learning opportunities so that they can be scholarly leaders who have high expectations, who support teacher implementation, who lead professional development, and also give teachers meaningful feedback. Again, I don't see a path to that without deep learning. And we also need teacher leaders to be a part of this journey as well, to run alongside our principals and deliver that professional development to our teachers, serve as models in their classroom, collaborate with their peers around really what does high quality literacy instruction look like.
So, Melissa, I want to follow up on just a couple of items that you talked about. Number one, you talked about the need for a robust MTSS system, and my colleague, Dr. Kim Gibbons, who's here today, who leads the Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement here at the university, and is also the co-director of what was called the Wisconsin-Minnesota Comprehensive Center, which there's 19 of them across the country. The feds send Kim some money. She provides some technical assistance to the Department of Education. But what that all means is that Kim and her team has been working with a really strong team at MDE to sort of put in place what will this Minnesota MTSS framework look like. And ironically, I think, 43 other states have an MTSS framework. And here we sit in Minnesota with actually one of the nation's experts in MTSS, and we're going to have one for the first time. So that's, I think, a really good step in the right direction. The other thing I just want to mention is you mentioned curriculum, right? And we sit, Emily, you may be aware, we sit in a very decentralized state. We're not like Florida or one textbook for all. And we have many small school districts. We have about 360 school districts. About 2/3 of those are like about 1,500 kids or less. So that means each one of those districts are making decisions independently about what curricular materials we should use. And so unlike the, Anoka Hennepins of the world that has, a whole office of teaching and learning or curriculum and instruction or whatever, that might be, there's then the Pine Islands of the world that probably don't have a curriculum director, and their principal could actually be someone like me. Like, I have a 712 English teaching degree. I have a master's in leadership. I have a K-12 principal's license, and I actually have a doctorate from the University of Minnesota. And guess how many reading courses I was ever required to take? Right? So we have a lot of folks sitting in leadership positions, I think, as you mentioned, that might be making these big financial curricular decisions that just might not have that background or training or expertise. So one more commercial for Carrie before we move on to the next. Kim is actually running a small, I guess I would describe it as a study, but a facilitated project with about 6 or 8 districts to look at their curriculum review process. I'm sorry, Kim, come on, be with me here. Which will yield some recommendations, I think, about curriculum resources, curricular materials, I should say, and also will yield a process that other districts can hopefully use in the future. So more to come on that. But I want to acknowledge that the work that you're doing in Roseville, while I lift it up all the time, I tell people I think Roseville is going to be the district to watch in the next 5 years as we think about this. There are many districts that just do not have the capacity to do kind of what you're doing. So as Dean Rodriguez said, one of our roles here at the Land Grant Institution is convening, and it's also sharing. And so Kim and her team will be ready to share some helpful resources as we move forward as well. So, Pani, I'm going to turn to you. Speaking of Research One Institution, right? We sit here today as on the campus of the state's Land Grant Institution, a Research One university. What do you see as currently going well, maybe in higher ed? And what are things that maybe we could do differently or do better to support the needs of K-12 schools, or maybe as in this effort to sort of close the research to practice gap?
That is a great question, and I have to say, Melissa, just want to acknowledge, it's amazing what you are doing, high quality instruction for everyone. It's at the heart of what we need to be striving for.
She's going to ask you if she can bring a research project in after.
She told me that.
Okay,
we're going to talk afterwards.
Just want to give you a heads up on that.
I won't mention in front of everybody, but we're going to have to talk.
We do want to work. So what is going well? I mean, there is amazing work that is happening in our institution, specifically in the College of Ed. We have experts on almost everything, reading and not reading related. We are generating new knowledge, field advancing knowledge. We are generating innovations. We're in a very unique position with investments that happened by Dean Rodriguez and our leadership team to have CARI, the center that Kim is leading, and Educational Technology Innovations, Ryan Warren and John Byrne is leading, and the work that you're doing, Katie. So we are uniquely positioned to solve this and many other problems because we have what we need to generate the knowledge. And we cannot stop there. We have our land grant mission in order to get all of that into the classroom, into the schools, into the districts. So if we work together to facilitate some infrastructure that would speed up the process, I think we could be making substantial impact in our kids' lives. Because the components are there, we just need to find a way to make that research to practice trip a little bit faster and sooner, right? A lot of what we study and develop, it takes a couple of years to get it into the literature. It doesn't get out immediately, but it's done in collaboration with teachers and classrooms. And if we have evidence and we know that it works, we can faster, go at scale and have that kind of impact. So I think infrastructure to allow for that research to practice gap to be bridged is really, really important. And the research, right? A research culture with everyone involved. You are reviewing curricula. I mean, you said you have like a 3-year. It's all gonna be database decision making, right? You're piloting things, you're trying things, and then going back and making those kinds of decisions. Those are the things that we can do together more effectively and faster. And we're here for it. We're here for it. So
I appreciate your point about the idea of infrastructure, and it is actually, it's one of the, I oftentimes say I really do have a pretty fantastic job here at the university, and I play a lot of roles, and one of them is sometimes this broker between folks like Pani and folks like Melissa, right? Because researchers, they want to put in to do a study or a grant, but they want to work with a school district, and that can be challenging. And so, having been a high school English teacher and an elementary and middle school principal, I do know kind of how schools work pretty much. And I know all the questions that principals or superintendents or assistant superintendents are going to ask about that research project, right? But I also know that if we don't, as leaders, sort of pause and say before we adopt the next shiny thing, right? Let's be honest, we got a lot of solutionitis going on in Minnesota. Right? And then so as folks who've been in the Principals Academy say, what's the first thing I always say to people before you do something? What's
the research say?
What does the research say? Right? It doesn't mean you have to do exactly what it says the way it says it, but let's at least be a little bit read on it and informed and make some of the, but that research can only tell us things if we partner with folks like Pani and others across the university and the college. And so Pani does actually have a project that is about to be launched. And if you wouldn't mind just sharing just a little bit about that. My friends in the back with it, oh, you're so good.
Aww.
Yeah, you guys should hire these people if you ever need any videoing or presentation going on.
Yeah. So here's my pitch, Melissa.
Okay.
So we worked for many, many years to develop a supplemental comprehension instruction that we envision being used in all kindergarten classrooms across the state and beyond. And it is fully automated and low impact on the teacher. That's huge, right? Because we know you need to be teaching phonics and get your kids to decode in kindergarten, but we cannot leave comprehension behind. And of course, I privilege comprehension because that's where most of our research is. But we are at the point where we develop something that is pretty amazing, and we have evidence that it works. And the federal government has given us more money to actually scale it up and document that robust evidence that our states then need to say, yes, this is an evidence-based approach. Go ahead and use it and scale it up so it can benefit the kids. So we have ongoing research. Please reach out. Please participate. We can really make a difference. And we do have our kids' best interest in mind. That's why we're here. That's why we do this work.
I just also want to comment. So we've mentioned now we're a land-grant institution a few times, and I had an opportunity to meet with Pani. This was a few months ago. She was telling me about this project, and she said, would you mind helping connect me with some schools, or what could we do? And she said, I did have the New York City public schools contact, and they would be interested in doing this study, and that would be it. Like, she could go into New York City public schools and wouldn't have to do much else. And Pani said, but I really want to do this in Minnesota. Like, that's, this is where I think this is what we're here for. So, so I think that's important. So as you think about what are questions that you might have even in practice or from where you sit, how can we be of help in helping to answer those questions, and how can we do that in partnership? So thank you for that. And don't worry, you'll get this in an email that comes after the fact, because we want to make sure you have all of the information that Pani would have to offer. So one last question before we open it up to the audience here for some questions. I'm going to pose it to all three of you. And it's this, the question is, what do you say to the idea that Emily's reporting, not to speak about you in the third person, your reporting, is rekindling the reading wars? So I ask this because I've heard, quite strongly, from what might be considered both sort of sides of this debate. So let me just frame up the two sides as I've sort of heard those. I've heard from a professor in higher education that the science of reading could be the road to room, that it could further put behind our Black and brown students because they're not having sort of this chance to find joy in reading, and we could be misinterpreting what it is, and we could really just be diving into sort of this didactic phonics instruction. I also heard recently from an elementary principal, I'm going to note African-American woman, who said, this is a debate you in higher ed think you have the luxury of engaging in. We don't have that kind of time in my school. Kids have a small window to learn to read, and it's a moral responsibility that I ensure that they learn how to read so that they can read to learn, whatever it is they want to learn. And then she said, also, kids are proud of themselves when they're learning to read. So these are sort of now I've given you the polars of that, right? But I'm wondering, what thoughts do you have about the critique? Emily, how do you feel about yourself being critiqued?
It's fine.
No, I'm just kidding. You actually handled it quite well, I will say.
You know, I mean, I liked your slide, which shows that the debate is getting, it looks like, less polarized. And I think that's what knowledge does. That's what 17 years, that's what this, you know, the research finally coming into practice. I think this idea that there's some danger that children aren't going to love reading just misunderstands how reading works, which is why I spend so much time trying to help people better understand that. Because no one loves reading if they can't do it. And it's the question of which comes first, sort of the chicken or the egg, right? And it is very clear that a lot of these things work in tandem. It's an exponential situation we've got going on here. But all of this started by talking to children and young adults and older adults who hate reading and don't do it because they can't. And so, yeah, that's all.
Good, good.
I'll dive in next.
Yeah.
I think what I struggle with is what's the alternative? And what I go back to is that Dr. Phil question of like, how's that working for us? About 50% of our third graders are not reading at grade level. We have a lot of kids out there counting on us to get it right. So for me, it goes back to this notion of scholarly leadership. And Katie talked a little bit about that. And where I first encountered that was through the University of Minnesota's Principals Academy. And that's teaching instructional leaders and principals to ask the question, what does the research say? So I'll highlight some of the findings, and I'm actually going to cite some of Kim Gibbons' work. And so I'll share maybe just three. One is the ability to read as a social justice issue. Reading equity starts with teachers being taught the science of reading. Two, along with having large gaps in reading proficiency, we've touched on this today, there's also large gaps between the research and the practice. And the research is really clear. The best approach to teach reading includes explicit instruction of phonemic awareness and phonics, as well as fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And even though data shows that the science of reading is effective, this conclusion has not yet been widely adopted in practice by public schools across our nation. And parents should not have to fight for their kids to learn how to read. Like, that is the responsibility of us as educators. I got one email maybe a year or so ago from a parent who was, really concerned and was citing some of your work, and I was like, yes, and here is what we are gonna do, I agree. And I wrote back and I didn't get a response, so I can only infer that it was like, cool, right? Like, you're doing the right stuff. And I think, folks are in different in different places on this journey. Some educators are well into it, some have just started, but my hope is that we're brave enough to put down some of our tools and learn and unlearn and think and rethink. And my hope is that if we do that, whether it's rekindling the reading wars or not, that if we engage in this, instead of 50% of our students in elementary schools leading as proficient readers, 95% of our students will be proficient readers. And I think that if anyone can do that, it's the educators sitting here in this room and across our state. So it gives me great hope to see the people that are, brave enough to engage in the conversation and wrestle with some of these hard things, because our kids are worth hard conversations.
Good, thank you, I appreciate that. I have to say this, when you just mentioned the parent who sent you the email, right? Kim and I were given a presentation to the School Boards Association a few weeks ago on this topic, and we really tried to position it from the standpoint of what can school board members do? Like, what are the questions they can ask? And at the end of the presentation, a gentleman came up to me, and he was from Roseau, Minnesota, which is about as far north as you can get before you hit Canada, and he was teary. He was a big, like, northern Minnesota guy. Like, I think he ice fished. If that puts us. I don't even think that's how you say it, is it?
Ice fishing?
He's an ice fisherman?
Sure.
Okay. Anyways, and he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "My wife is a teacher, and our son can still not read. And every time I go to conferences, it's, don't worry, it's gonna get better, don't worry, it's gonna get better." And then I said, and imagine how that teacher feels. He said, "I know, because they don't know what to do or how to help." And he said, and I'm just really struggling with how to start that conversation. So we hope that this conversation it would be helpful on that regard. I want to continue it, though, with members of the audience, and so I'm going to ask both Alex and Ryan to do the moving of the microphones around. Please note that I have not asked women to Vanna White the room.
Can I say one thing?
Please.
The things that you two said. I think there's a lot of, I worry, I'm curious and worry a little bit about 5 or 10 years from now, people looking back on what happened with this whole science of reading thing, and we have a tendency, I think, to just move on too quickly in education, and I just really hope there's sustained, really good work like you're doing that stays on this for years, because I don't think this is going to be fixed quickly. Mm-hmm. But also, I have cited, and you just cited, this idea that 95% of kids can be proficient readers. And I want us to, just 2 things about that. I don't know that the research that shows that that's true included a lot of intervention work, mm-hmm. a lot of work one-on-one with kids who need it. Fixing core instruction is not going to be enough. And we are still, as you know, reading recovery was something I talked about a lot in Sold a Story. Something that reading recovery really got right is there are kids, and there will always be kids, who need intensive one-on-one help.
That's right.
And we need to make sure that that is part of it. We need to teach all kids to read in the classroom, keep up small group instruction, because kids are at very different places with this. And in your schools, in every classroom, there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 kids who need intensive small group and one-on-one help. And you just can't forget that. We're not getting to 95% unless we do that too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. Thank you for that. So we'd like to open it up for some questions. Before we do that, it's amazing when you come to the university, especially when you're in a room with mostly faculty members, the ability to ask a question is really challenging. Because it really more so turns into a, let me tell you for 3 minutes about my idea. And then I will ask the question, maybe. So I've heard from some practitioners who have said to me, when you facilitate these conversations, Katie, could you really get to questions? So we're going to really work hard to try to do that in this next session here. So just like sometimes when, anyone ever been in a first grade classroom and you see all the kids doing this? Right? Because they want to share. They've got a connection, right? And then you call on them and they're like, right? So we're just going to take a moment for you to think about your questions. We're going to give you just 2 minutes turn and talk to a neighbor. We're gonna let the people in the back who have been standing the whole time come on in and get a seat. We got more seats on this side. I'm sorry, Scott, bring all the folks from there through the back and over, and then we'll be good. And then Alex and Ryan are going to get us started on some questions here in about 2 minutes. So please turn and talk for 2 minutes with your friends.
That's awesome.
Good idea. Can we get it?
If she wants.
I think you might have.
Test. Okay. All right, folks, thank you. We are going to gather now in about 10 seconds. We're only at 5, so that's good. 2, 1. Wow. All right. So both Ryan and Alex are going to be happy to sort of move about the room. We're interested in your questions. If you have a question that you want to direct specifically to either Pani or Emily or Melissa, happy to do that. Otherwise, I might try to figure out where we're going to toss it to. So here we go.
Hi, thank you for this today. It's been a great learning opportunity. I just wanted to say that as someone in the pre-K-12 system and no longer finally being in graduate school, a big problem with the research to practice gap is access to the research. Mm-hmm. And so my question would be...
I love that. She got right to it. Did you see that? Some of you were like, I don't know if she's going to do it. She's got it. Thank you.
Could MDE or carry for a nominal fee to educators get access to some kind of, Sage or JSTOR or one of those so that we could access the research?
So, thank you.
That's the question.
I'll take that. So, a couple things. Number one, actually, I have a very nice document that one of the researchers at Carey put together, which is where are all of the open access things available, and very simple for folks to find some pretty good research. So I will say that, number one. Number two, for those of you working in schools, and this is an end round, but I am going to say this, oftentimes at least one person in that school building is enrolled in some sort of graduate program, right? So, not that you should steal from a university, but you can usually access through that person. The last thing I'm going to say, 2 more things I'm going to say. I find 95% of the time, if you email one of the authors of an article you want that's behind a paywall, they'll email it to you. And yes.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
That's how I get them always.
And I will add one more.
Please.
If I can. Call us. It's part of our job to be up to date with everything that has to do with our discipline. And we're here for you. So if you want to know more about reading, if you want to know about math, call us at the U and we will come and share that information with you. It's part of our job. So we're here.
Thank you for that.
Can I say one other thing?
Please.
I mean, not to say that you shouldn't be going right to original research, but I don't know that people in schools necessarily have to be going to all of the original studies. So much of this has been put together in books with lots of citations. There are good blogs. There are just good ways to access it. And as someone who has read a lot of the original studies, you don't necessarily need to read them all. There's really a good way to get the information that you need in other ways. I'm not discouraging you from going to the original, but I'm not so sure that a teacher or even an administrator needs to be reading the most recent journal articles all the time. Was that a terrible thing to say?
No. I mean, honestly, we publish and we write the work for each other, right? In academic world. But we do the translation also, and that's the part that I think we can facilitate. The same way you ask the experts for their opinion, in medical field and so on, and they can share, okay, what's the best available evidence right now about, my thyroid problem? Then you find it. Same thing. So get to the experts, and we will share that with you. Perhaps not as effective as Emily Hanford does, but we will do our best.
We're working on it, though. Ryan.
Hi, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on teacher ed. And the reason I'm interested in that, we haven't talked about it yet. And then one thing, having become a teacher, I did not learn any of the science of reading when I came up through my teacher education. Kind of sought that out on my own, but interested to hear how much there is to learn before getting your teaching certificate in such a short amount of time. So what's the role of the university there? And then what is the role of the school in the school district to have the ongoing learning to, once teachers are in service, how to support the vast amount of learning that still needs to happen just for reading, for example, let alone all the other topics.
Emily, well, let's start with you on sort of your take on what you know about teacher ed.
Well,
Not here at the University of Minnesota.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say this. I think that there's a lot of evidence that we don't just writ large prepare our teachers well enough in this country for enough time and do a good enough job. And that has to do with a lot of historical things and the ways that ultimately we don't actually value teaching as much as we should. That said, yes, you can clap for that. And I think teachers need better preparation. Teachers need better work conditions. Teachers need to be paid more. There's a lot of things that teachers need more of that we're not giving them. With any profession, there's only so much you're going to learn before you go into the profession. So much of what you learn, and so much, it should be this way, that you're learning it on the job. So it's just a hugely important role for what's happening in professional development as you go. So it's really both. I think we need to fix the teacher education program, and you shouldn't graduate not learning about the science of reading. That needs to be fixed, but you're never going to learn everything you need to know, and you should be continuing to learn it in schools. And we have the kids right now who are in first grade and second grade and third grade and ninth grade right now, and they need teachers right now who understand this stuff. And so they're not going back to teacher preparation. So it's on the schools to do it, and it always will be. And there's lots of turnover in schools. I don't know, you want to talk about that? I think that's a huge challenge here, schools investing in this stuff, and then teachers leave. Right. So what do you do about that?
Right, that's something that we're working through a little bit with letters, right? So part of where that originated with our teachers was through that literature review. And it was not me standing up in front of them saying, here's what you're gonna do, and you're gonna do it with fidelity, and you're gonna be held accountable, right? It was, here's what the research says. What should we do? And they together decided, we all need to be trained in the science of reading. We all need letters. And then what was next is, but then what about when new teachers come on board? And so we're still creating that plan of what does that look like to onboard? And then what we were talking about before we came out is, how many of you remember being a first-year teacher? Right? You're drinking water out of a fire hose. You don't know how to make copies or call in sick, much less engage in a really heavy, intensive professional developed 2-year plan of letters, right? So maybe it's not year 1. Maybe it's years 2 and 3 that then we're scooping up all new educators in our system. But you do have to have a system in place. Otherwise, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're going to be back in that same place.
Yeah, thank you. Alex, yeah.
A core group of us in higher ed in Minnesota are looking to do that deep learning and revise our programs of teacher preparation, and then partner with schools so that our candidates get a chance to practice in the field before they actually enter the field. And we're curious, Emily, in your research, did you come across any universities that have created sort of this pipeline of SOR trained teachers that you would recommend that we study from?
That's a good question. I feel like I should, do you guys have answers to that one?
So I would actually maybe think about the podcast that was done about teaching by APM Reports as well, and how some folks have are you all familiar? What's the name of the podcast? It's on Educate, and it's basically like, so you want to be a teacher, and all of the issues that we face.
Who wants to be a teacher?
Who wants to be a teacher? So you want to be a teacher.
That's what it's called.
I'm never going to get a job in media. But I think what that particular podcast does is really talks about the multiple approaches that different states have taken, what has kind of worked and what really didn't work. And I know that's not, your reporting or your responsibility, but I think that that's one place that I would say to look to. The other thing I would say is this, with regards to teacher education, then I'll hand it back to you, Emily, is it is a both and, right? So yes, we in higher ed institutions need to be doing our job, but let's be honest, K-12 schools, we also have to be partnering with those higher ed institutions in meaningful ways, and not when they call and say, can we place a student teacher? Yeah, put them in so-and-so's room, Or, frankly, yeah, it's tough to get subs right now. No, you don't get to use your student teachers as subs all day long, right? So we in K-12 really also have a responsibility in what does that student teaching experience really look like, and who's going to bear the cost of that student teaching experience, right? So, I mean, clearly I'm sure they would love it if I said this, but if I ran down to the legislature today and said, we're sitting on $17.6 billion, how do we make teacher education have a residency, right? Okay, how do school districts think about, how can we think about having teachers maybe make, a living wage while student teaching, right? These are things that we as educational leaders, we actually have a voice in, can advocate for both at the state level, and can think about our own budgets. Because the budgets are our reflections of our, thank you, Dr. Alexander. Next.
I have a question about supporting students beyond fourth grade. So I support secondary literacy, and we have students who are coming to us who have gaps in their skills. And I'm wondering if there are recommendations or approaches you're taking in Roseville. The training seems a lot focused on K-4, but what's appropriate for our intervention teachers in training beyond fourth grade, and how do we apply the strategies to students who are in adolescence?
Right. I don't think that is an uncommon question, right? Like, I think it would come up in many, many districts. For us, we're doing kind of a staggered implementation, and so what the research has shown it is best to train K-4 teachers where to start, but then what about our 5-6 teachers, right? Like, they need to learn that science of reading behind it as well. I also think it would be transformational if by the time kids got to 5th grade or middle school or high school, if all of your kids could read and write, right? So I think that's where the energy and focus is right now. And I think also we need to be training our 5th and 6th grade teachers around phonics and phonemic awareness until some of that gap gets filled back up, because you're going to be doing that with your teachers or with your students as well. One way that we are approaching it in Roseville is through our intervention. So we use FAST and PRESS. And I'll be honest, like I've
to University of Minnesota.
Yes. Yes.
Developed products. Sorry.
Correct. Formative assessment systems for teachers, and then PRESS is the interventions that go along with that. And I'll be honest, like I wasn't a big fan of it at first. Like I critiqued and judged and wanted to argue with some of the elements in it. And the more that I get further into my letters training, the more I'm like, oh, that aligns actually quite well. And so where we've approached it for 5-6 teachers is more through the lens of we're going to do those 3 screenings a year. We're going to do some progress monitoring. We're going to do some interventions. So if I was in your shoes right now as a 5th grade teacher, I would be focusing on the intervention learning. As we kind of fill those gaps for kids around phonics and phonemics awareness. Because the vast majority of your 5th and 6th graders probably won't need that, but some absolutely will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is I think there is a huge amount of volunteer energy out there. There are a lot of people who do volunteer with groups that help kids with reading, and many of those people haven't gotten the training that they need in how to really help kids to read. And I think that they can. I think that there is really an awareness that sort of high dosage tutoring, especially post-COVID, is something that a lot of kids need and a lot of older kids. And one of the things that I would love to see, because I think there's a lot of interest and concern in this issue among the general public, is working with groups in your communities that can tap into volunteer energy and time and training them, finding a good program, training them on it, and having them work with the 5th and 6th and 9th and 12th graders, and the 1st graders too. Because I think it can be done. I think people can be trained in a program, and people don't necessarily want to hear that. Trained in a program and deliver it effectively and really help kids. And I feel like school systems should be working on that in their sort of community partnerships.
Thank you. Connie?
One thing to add, I think technology can be very useful in this context. We have a lot of advances in the development of intelligent tutoring systems that are very adaptive, and they can provide that one-to-one kind of support in the privacy of someone's even home or in school. Because thinking about those middle and high schoolers who are struggling with reading, that's a really, really difficult situation to be in. So tailoring those kinds of supports with advancements in technology can be very useful. And there is a lot out there in terms of what it has been developed and it has been tested. Again, there is that research to practice gap, but there are multi-component programs and adaptive tutoring systems that are available, and they could be used to support reading and comprehension in those higher grades. And it makes sense, you know, we focus on pre-K through 4. I mean, we want to prevent reading difficulties, but, you know, our house is on fire, so we do need to pay attention to those middle and high schoolers as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Alex? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for everything. You guys have been awesome. I wanted to address again the must learn our way out of this and the PD questions that people have been asking and wondering, Melissa, in your district, we have teachers that want letters training. We have, I mean, that graph that says we're kind of getting to the same page. We are getting to that point, and we have teachers that want this training, but we are struggling with when and how to give them that training and provide that training, because they work their butts off all day long. And they want to do this 80-hour training. So just some ideas maybe in what you're doing to give them the opportunity to access that training.
Right, that is real. And to further contextualize it, let's think of where we've been the last couple of years in education. Like, raise your hand if it was easy through COVID, right? Like, our teachers are not at peak resiliency or capacity. And so I think even for us, like, it was something we wrestled with of like, do we dive right into this? Our teachers were like, we have to. Like, it doesn't feel right not to. And we also had like a staggered start. So through MDE, there's some opportunity there. So we have kind of waves of teachers that have gone through this, one with the MDE cohort and then one with our internal cohort as well. And so we tried to get creative with, we're gonna carve out some time during the week, during their contractual day, where they can fit this in. And so we've done things like reduced staff meetings. We've done things like no meeting Mondays, right? So like before or after school, that's their time. But let's also be real about that. That was their prep time to begin with, right? So that's not like actually providing more time. So we continue to monitor it closely. It's not an easy lift. We have by no means arrived. One of the things that we've talked a little bit about, we haven't implemented yet, was what if we were able to provide some relief during the school day? And so what if we did, we took our K-4 students and we took the rest of our staff, our 5, 6 teachers, our specialists, any intervention teachers, and we had like stations that they went to throughout the day. It could be an assembly, right? It could be labs and learning opportunities, so then it frees up our K-3 teachers, or what if we even do it in half-day chunks? So we've tried to get creative and haven't really found traction in that yet. Do I believe teachers are doing it all in their contracted day? Absolutely not. you have a student who comes in early, you have a parent that calls, you've got to prep for a lesson that you're going to be teaching in 20 minutes. So in theory, it sounds great to say we're going to carve out meeting time on Monday to do this work. And I know teachers are going above and beyond and doing this at home and on evenings and on weekends too. So you can try to be creative, and it just is a lift.
One of the things I will say Melissa does very well is she does not come up with those ideas in isolation. She does it in collaboration with teachers and with principals, and says basically what is realistic here and what isn't, and what can we do within the confines of the contract that we have and what we're trying to get done. So I think for the teachers in the room, you also have to lead up. Right? I mean, to say to principals, I actually have an idea on how this could work. I'll tell you, some of my best scheduling ideas, they didn't come from me as a school principal. They came from the teachers in the building that told me, you don't realize this, but this train's about to go off the track. Let me help you fix it, right? So lead up to your leaders, and leaders, we gotta ask the teachers. They're the ones, right? Let's not ask them to do stuff like 3 days in a row and then never give them a prep. So I think that collaboration has to happen. We're here? Yeah.
So Emily, I want another story. I want a story that looks back, and I want a story that looks forward. And this is what I want to hear. I want to hear when you've worked so hard, you're the most recognized voice in educational journalism. Everybody in this room loves you. But what we want to know is when you look back over these years that's really challenging, what's the hardest pushback that you got? How did you find the resolve to go forward? That's the story looking back. And then the story looking forward is, what's next? Like, what question is really curious to you that's going to help us with this next step?
Wow.
Question.
Well, on the looking back, I think what you're asking me, so I don't know, I'm a very one day at a time kind of person. And I just sort of, the resolve to do this work, I appreciate people saying things like, this was so hard and you get so much pushback and how can you take it all? And I don't know, I just keep doing it. I don't know, I've developed a thick skin somehow, and I think the resolve is because this started with talking to the struggling readers and their moms. And there's just and their dads in many cases too, but it's a lot of moms. And I just have heard so much pain. I've just had so many phone calls where people just sob at the same time. And I just heard the same story over and over again. And it's the story, everything's gonna be fine, he'll be fine, and then he isn't. So that's, I think, what just kept me going. And in terms of what's next, I mean, I don't know. I think there's obviously a lot to do, and this is overwhelming to sort of document what's happening. And the Rosevilles of the world, and the research that's being done, and are we really going to get it right this time, or are we really going to make a difference? How are we measuring that? How are we going to see a change in NAEP scores, which is not ultimately, I think, our best guide? But yeah. And I would say that I have a lot of things that I really want to know. To tell you the truth, one of the things that I'm most interested in is this older kids question. So what do you do now that they're in 5th and 6th and 9th and 12th grade? It's a practical question. It's a question of what kinds of programs. I'm really interested in that question because that really matters.
Thank you.
Thank you all for this morning. It's just been so inspiring and fascinating, and it's hard to ask a question after what Susan asked.
Right.
Mine is more of a messaging question. What advice do you have for us, and I'm speaking as a teacher educator, who face resistance from colleagues, who refer to science of reading as trendy, almost, and I've seen it with air quotes, the science of reading. And then a second or a sub-question for that then is letters, professional development in Minnesota has almost become a dirty word in some venues, and I think that's really unfortunate. And so I'm looking for advice about how to respond to those criticisms? So that's my question.
As somebody who spans K-12 and higher ed, I'm actually one of, I think, very few people, Kim and I maybe are kind of very few people that span K-12 and higher ed. That's a higher ed issue. It's not a K-12 issue right now. Yep. So, what I would say to that is, here's the calls I get from superintendents. Who should we be hiring from? Who's really training teachers, right? And I think that, I know that there are higher ed institutions in the state of Minnesota that are doing a very good job, this being one of them, right? But higher ed institutions need to be able to convey that to school districts in ways that they understand. They don't want to read your 17-page syllabus. They want to know, are you helping to prepare those teachers coming out? And what then, higher ed could be very helpful in this. What should we be doing and how can we be picking them up from teacher ed and bringing them into our school districts? Where should we meet them at, right? So if higher ed wants to continue to sort of have the argument around whatever the argument is, or you know, like, I'm going to be honest, nobody in K-12 cares about your academic freedom. They just don't. So, sorry. I'm glad you have it. Right? So let's put ourselves in the space of higher ed, right? Or in the space of K-12. We have a perceived teacher shortage in the state of Minnesota. I say perceived because we have plenty of licensed teachers on paper. They're choosing not to practice, right? So we can't get substitute teachers right now to come in and help with this alleviation of whatever. A lot of our substitute teachers were our retired teachers. They didn't come back after the pandemic, right? So we have to start to think about what are the ways we can collaborate and listen to both. So I would encourage the higher ed folks in the audience today, whatever institution you're from, boy, I hope you're meeting with your district superintendents on a regular basis, asking them what they need, sharing with them what you're doing. Because that's how I think we can really have that sort of collaboration. We have an entire office here that works to do that. So, yeah.
One thought. Can I say one thought on that? I think it's because Melissa did such a good job talking about how you have to confront people's emotions and like what's going on for them. And I think it's important to think about what might be going on for people in higher ed and why they're resisting. And I think for a lot of teachers, it's guilt and shame, and it's seeing the faces of the kids they know they didn't help and their names. And I think that there's more of an ego thing probably going on in higher education because their professional reputations, they've published on this, they've taught this, they're a little bit more distance from the it's actually maybe a little bit harder to access because I think for a lot of the teachers, they break down pretty quickly. They're close to the kids they didn't teach, so they know the stakes of this in sort of a visceral way. And this isn't a criticism in higher ed, but just by the nature of the job, they're just one more step removed. And it just might be like a little bit more of a lift and a reach to get them to like be vulnerable. But I guess it's just sort of like the being kind and recognizing that. And I think at the end of the day, for a lot of teachers, they end up opening up to this because they realize that they do find the other people around them who want to do it. So I guess it's kind of the same in higher ed. It's like pointing them out to the other professors and instructors who have had a change of heart on this or who have always known this stuff. I think it's just about finding those people and trying to like lift them up and point them out to other people and invite them out to coffee and lunch and just be nice and ask them what the resistance is about.
Right. I was thinking about that too. One of the things we were talking about before we came out today is I wonder if I would be this engaged in the conversation or this open to change if I was still a reading recovery teacher, if I was still a classroom teacher. Like I have, it takes probably, it's not as heavy as an emotional lift when I'm a little bit more removed. I've been a principal, I've been a coach, I've been in teaching and learning. I was in teaching and learning during COVID, so if there's other people who are doing that, like we can create a therapy group at the end here. But even like as an assistant superintendent, I have more of a balcony perspective. And so I wonder if that makes the lift a little bit easier. But I agree with you. I think we have to get real curious. I think we have to practice empathy and compassion and unpack resistance and frame it as fear. Like that's really the undercurrent to resisting.
And it's ultimately about little children, right? And so just go there. Not to make people feel guilty, but for people to know what the end goal here is and why they, why change matters.
And I think we also need to feel comfortable with the idea that academics may never agree. That's the nature of the work that we do. We have commitments, epistemological commitments. We have favorites in terms of our theories and approaches. The goal is not for all of us to agree, but we do need to go with the best available evidence at the time. And I think deciding to go with that from the practice point of view makes perfect sense. And it's okay if, we don't agree. I mean, climate science is the same way, right? You still have that 5% that is fighting it. Anti-vaccine efforts the same way. You still have that percentage that is fighting it. So best available evidence at the time. Don't expect of all academics to agree and to get on board. They will not. So.
One here? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Cindy Jaban from NWEA. When I was first trained as a teacher, it was in a joint special ed and elementary ed program, and it was, what's the word? The folks training me did not agree, right? It was a healthy thing. But it's given me a perspective over the years around this science of reading that feels like it was always there in special ed psych, certain journals. But somehow CNI, elementary ed, have other journals, have other spaces. And I'm wondering, how does, as we get things like general ed classroom teachers are supposed to do systematic and explicit phonics instruction, which used to be down the hall in the special ed room only, how does the relationship between those special ed, general ed kind of need to evolve? And then as a sort of bonus question, isn't this going to play out in math as well? And Emily, could that be your next topic? And if not you, then who should I look to for sort of the science of math?
Anyone want to take the first part first?
Academia is siloed, right? And that's an issue. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we do study the same things from different perspectives, and that disconnect is, I think, what you're noting. We need to do better. I think we need to break down those siloed walls so we can do better in teacher prep, and we can do better in research to, practice partnerships. And that's where, systemic barriers may need to be addressed, because we do function in different departments, we do function in different disciplines, we do publish in different papers, in different journals, and we do attend different conferences, right? So finding ways to bridge, those disciplines in the interest of little kids and our missions and goals would be important. And I think that's where institutions can be very influential in doing so.
I also think higher ed can be just hard to find the front door to knock on and be like, who do I ask? So I think higher ed also can do the reverse of that, which is what I think trying to suggest earlier is they need to be in schools, right? And not just necessarily for that research project. I just had a researcher that works for Kim. I bring her out to the Principals Academy to work with my folks on their action research project over 2 years. And every time she comes, she's like, thank goodness I come here, because this is a real reality check for what these leaders are going through and what their questions are about what's happening in their schools and what their realities are, right? And so I would just say that curiosity that we're asking educators to have and learning and reading, et cetera, I would say, can that curiosity go the other way, right? Can folks in higher ed, folks like Pani and myself and others, are we in schools? Are we watching how kids are actually getting reading instruction, or are we just reading about it in the journal articles? So I think it's a two-way street. So I hope that by doing that could help with the siloing in higher ed. So.
And I definitely get a lot of emails about the math question. And I think I do think that there's a unifying issue. And it is actually what makes this difficult for a lot of people and sort of controversial. But it's this question of what we want school to be like for little children. And I think many of us, I certainly felt this way as a mother, and the decisions that I made about my kids' schooling really wanted my little kids to be in a place where they were doing a lot of exploring and learning on their own, getting recess twice a day, and I still want that. I want that for my grandchildren. But I think I have had a really profound recognition in understanding more about cognitive science and the brain and how we learn, that little children need more instruction than we're giving them. They need to be taught how to do these things that are so important, and that the creativity and the inquiry that we want ultimately everyone's life to be able to be about comes from having skills and having knowledge and knowing things that you are taught. And yes, we need to give kids lots of time to play and create, but we also need to teach them the things that they need to know. And that is the only way to create a system that is actually going to work for everybody, and that is going to be equitable, as close to equitable as we can in the end, because we're not going to achieve total equity here. This language comprehension side of things is actually harder. Kids are always going to there are always going to be kids who come into school with way more advantages on that, and the advantages don't go. It's not like they show up in kindergarten with the advantages and then everything gets equalized. They keep getting the advantages. They get taken to Europe. They get taken to museums. They always will. But anyway, I think we need to really recognize the things that we know everyone needs to know, and we need to teach it to them.
Thank you. We have time for 2 short questions. Where am I? Thank you.
I've never been home.
Oh, Dr. Hillman.
There we go. Switch it on. People wish I had a mute button. First of all, I'm happy I'm on Katie Pekel's listserv, because this has been both fantastic and affirming. Thank you for the convening power. Outstanding. So let's talk about scaling. Emily Hanford. We know a lot. We are in a state that loves to both talk about doing things statewide, but always, and I mean always, defaults back to local control. Mm-hmm. So what is the statewide policy sweet spot where we can make sure that your zip code does not define whether you get this or not, and also to Melissa's point of being in that sweet spot between managing and learning our way out of the problem? Where is this being done at scale well, and what can we learn from those states?
Wow, yeah. I mean, I think it's a recognition that policy is one lever, not the only one, an important one, and that policies, good policies have to do with a lot of different things. So passing a law isn't enough. It's making sure that there are the resources to implement that law, and that there's accountability and monitoring, but not in a, like we're going to beat you over the head kind of way, but like ultimately the point of this law is to try to change something and make something happen differently. So we're here to help you do it differently. I mean, many people have pointed to Mississippi, and I have too. And I think one of the things about Mississippi, it's a relatively small state that was doing very badly, didn't have anything to lose to invest in making a big change, but recognized what a multifaceted problem this is. So made the policy and the investments be about teacher prep and professional development and teacher time. There's a lot of different things that they did there. So I think you just need to have a state. I guess the other thing I would say is I feel like the legislators need to know about the science of reading too. And it is in danger of becoming a fad, for sure. What does that term mean? People are using it in lots of different ways. But when I speak to legislative groups, I'm like, I have a reading list on our website. Get one of these books and read it. Mm-hmm. Know something about it too. Don't let your aides, I've listened to a lot of debate in state legislatures, and there's some very embarrassing moments where people really don't know what they're talking about. And it's important that everyone knows something about what they're talking about. And this stuff is really fascinating and interesting, and picking up a book about the science of reading, it's a good read. It's worth it.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Matt actually is humble and also our state superintendent of the year.
Okay.
Yes. So one more.
Yes, any comments you have on the research or just your own experience on engaging and educating and encouraging parents? I think you've done a great job, Emily, and really appreciate that literacy is at the top of a lot of parents' lists, top of mind right now. And now I think part of the work is how do we steer them in the right direction so everything just doesn't become the first thing they see on Google, and I'm going to go ahead and do this. So any comments you have on that would be helpful.
So I think you're talking about like the parents who come with an article and they're really hot and bothered about it. Yeah. Well, the best is if you have an answer. This is what we're doing. So,
Right.
You want to take that?
Yeah, I'll add on to that because I think one of the things that we're still really in our learning phases, right? And as I was listening to that question and reflecting, I'm like, we really haven't done a great job of communicating with our families, right? In the sense of like, we deeply value reading. Here are all the things that are happening in Roosevelt area schools to ensure that every child leaves our system as a reader and a writer, right? And so I think part of it is communicating out, not just waiting for families to come to us, but proactively communicating the work that's taking place as well.
You know, I think every parent drops their little child off for kindergarten and expects that they're going to be taught how to read. And I actually think if you sort of dig deep into what's been happening with reading as a society, I'm not going to say this is the schools, in some way, and I see this in pushback to my work, in some ways there's actually a belief out there that parents are supposed to do it. That if kids aren't reading, it's the parents who are supposed to fix it. And I actually think we're encountering this question. Whose job is it to teach kids how to read? And I think parents are coming to you saying like, look, I found this I found this article and you guys are supposed to do it. What are you doing? How are you doing it? And so I appreciate the fact that you're probably getting a kind of like out of proportion sense of urgency on the part of some parents. And it's just like, wait a minute, take a deep breath. But I do think your ultimate answer is, well, we have an answer to that. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And don't worry, everything's going to be fine. It really will, because we're really doing it. And if it's not, come to me, because if your kid needs extra help, we have a way to provide that too.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So first of all, I want to thank our panelists for being here today for this conversation. Before we wrap up, though, I want to briefly return to the question of how. Again, all of the questions that I got when I solicited, almost all of them were around the how. And I think you even heard some of those type of how questions here today. So my role at the university is primarily focused on the development of school and system leaders. And as I mentioned at the outset, I had this opportunity, thanks to Susan and Christine for coming and saying, can we help? So I want to briefly share with you an opportunity that's coming up regarding the how, and that's really around the development of leaders. So I'm going to do that. You guys don't have to sit on the stage if you want. You can move. It's totally up to you, but I'm going to stand up. Otherwise, I can't see what I'm going to be talking about. So this will just take a minute or two. So first of all, if you want access to this presentation because you want to come back to it later, or there's issues or ideas in it that are helpful, go ahead and do that. Do you notice my QR code?
It's fancy.
All by myself. My communications director is telling me not to worry, this will all be sent to you as well. All right, so we are launching what we're calling Literacy Learning for Leaders. And this is a video series accompanied by professional development modules that are really to provide support for leaders in understanding effective reading instruction. It's been prepared for principals and other school leaders by folks with us at the Minnesota Principals Academy. Largely, I'm going to say, my very talented graduate research assistant, Amanda Jensen, who's actually a PhD student of Panis. Yep, and then also all of our friends at HELP, the Higher Education Literacy Partnership. So what does this mean? We've got 14 video modules that are grouped into 4 units. Those are the Science of Reading, MTSS, Letters, and our 4th unit, which is Every Voice Counts, touches on some very specific topical areas. All of those videos are uploaded onto our website as we speak today. What's going to accompany those, thanks to Amanda, is a series of prepared professional development materials. How that will work is it'll happen in online cohorts, and the idea is that we're going to scale that up for the state right off the bat writ large. Those cohorts would meet 5 times. The first time is 30 minutes, sort of a grounding introduction to what we're going to do. The other 4 times is an hour each. Those online sessions are going to focus really on the content that you watched in the video, videos as preparation for coming to that collaboration, and then the application. These will hopefully be facilitated at the local level, so we've invited representatives of all of the service cooperatives, the centers of excellence, the number of folks at MDE that are going to go through our initial Leader of Leaders cohorts that we're kicking off very soon. What's in the professional development? A number of resources I just want to quickly highlight today. First is a video guide. This is the how are we engaging the preconceptions of folks as they watch the videos, okay? So some prompting questions, graphic organizer. You can use this if you'd like to. Then we've got resources that are prepared for the facilitator of the cohort. So we've even written the communication for you if you'd like. So here's the email you send out that says, here's what we're going to be doing in this online cohort. And then we've got a facilitator guide for you. So it links you to all of the materials, tells you what to do in each of the sessions and how you're going to do that. All of these facilitator materials will be housed on the University of Minnesota, what we call Canvas site. Canvas is like our Google Classroom here. And we'll be happy to hand those over to you once we've walked through them with you in an initial sort of train the trainer cohort. All free. Am I going to get CEUs? You certainly are, if I can get BOSA to return my email. I'm just kidding. They're on board. Just kidding. So what's the first thing we're going to do? We're going to give you the slides that you can use in these online sessions. The first thing we do in all of the sessions follow this sort of pattern, engaging preconceptions. So for example, we'll use a Jamboard to say, where are you at with how you're feeling about takeaway 2, the idea of structured literacy. Once folks tell us how they feel, the facilitator then can differentiate where are we going to go into with the review of the content. So I might need more clarification on the concept, so I'm going to walk through it a little bit slower with 3 slides, or I'm feeling really comfortable about teaching this concept, and I could teach it to others. We're just going to do a quick overview of what was in that takeaway then. After we do that, we're going to let folks get into breakout rooms and have an opportunity to have some discussion around their own practice and how they're working to implement or engage in these things in their own districts. And then, of course, we have a reflection and discussion guide because we're going to have an opportunity for some metacognition. So we'll give you some questions that you can use to think about what am I doing and what could I do next. And finally, of course, who doesn't love 17 hyperlinks that could take us to more reading? So we also have relevant links and resources that will take you to additional things that could be helpful for you. So how do we get involved? The Leader of Leaders cohort will actually kick off, I think it's Friday. Is it Friday? Like the kickoff, yeah. Okay. So we'll do a couple of informational sessions. The Leader of Leaders cohort is actually going to start very quickly. We already have about 35 folks in that particular cohort, but we are interested in finding out what are other ways that other folks want to engage. The regional cohorts, of course, are housed in our 9 service cooperatives and 6 MDE regional centers of excellence. We do at this point have representation from all of them with an attempt to reach statewide. Then we think some others might want to launch their own cohort, which we think is a great idea as well. That could happen, for example, let's say you're in a particular MESPA division, or maybe you want it within your school district itself, or maybe you want to do it amongst a professional organization that you're working with. So we're going to have 2 informational sessions online. They're coming up on February 10th and February 16th. There's an opportunity to RSVP on our website. This is ironic when I say on our website. We didn't have a website 5 days ago if it were not for Alex Evenson, our communications person. So we would really encourage you to sign up for that. Amanda and myself at Minimum will be at those sessions. We're partnering with MDE on this as well. They have a large role in this. All thanks to the folks from the Higher Education Literacy Partnership who put together the original content videos for us. So let's please thank them. Again, access to the presentation if you want that today. I would take just a few quick questions about the free tools that we're making available if you have questions. You'll have to use your playground voice or your high school basketball game voice. Oh, thank you.
Just a real quick question as far as the Canvas site?
Yeah.
So when we take the materials out to deliver out into our regions, will we have access to that site, or will we have to have a platform too?
You'll have access to the Canvas site. That's the thing we can give you for free, not our articles. We'll keep those behind a paywall. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, the Canvas site will be available. I appreciate the question. I also got a question from one of the service cooperatives. Do we have to be certified to use the materials? No. Do we have to follow them exactly in the script that you have them? No. We're not conducting a research project here. We just want to get good information out into the hands of leaders. So if you feel like, 4 sessions isn't enough, I'm going to do 5 in our region. Whatever works for you. Last but not least, I've been getting a little bit of I'm not sure we have the content expertise to facilitate this, or I'm not totally sure. Here is the best part about having Dean Rodriguez. I went to Dean Rodriguez and said, so I've got these videos. I'm going to need some professional development. As it turns out, I don't have the time to do it. So you think you could, fund a graduate research assistant? Sure, Katie, whatever. So, ta-da, Amanda. Just happened to be with Dean Rodriguez last week, and I said, this thing's really going to take off. I'm going to need a graduate research assistant again next year. And he's like, I'm assuming you would like me to pay for that. I sure would. So Amanda is going to be working with us all through next year so that if there's a district or a cooperative or a region that says we need some help in facilitating these, or we're not sure how to go about it, or we need to check in, Amanda's going to be available to help do that. So think of that when you're making donations to the University of Minnesota. Just kidding.
So Katie, just real simple, if you're a district and you want your principals to access the modules and participate in it, they would go to the information session in early February, and they could have help from Amanda, and it could happen very easily.
Correct.
And they're going to love the modules.
They are going to love the modules. Yes. In fact, the introductory module is actually a conversation that I was lucky enough to have with Emily. So and this conversation today was also recorded, so that will be up on our website as well. And then there's really good content from researchers and practitioners, folks in higher ed, folks in K-12 settings, on topics that are really relevant. I do want to just say that, for example, the section on letters, it is not letters training. It's what to know about letters, and that letters is not the only thing, right? I'm getting a little concerned that we're starting to see that as a potential inoculation. It's not, right? Because if we put teachers into letters training, but they don't have the right assessment system, or they don't have decodable text, or they don't have the coaching and support, we've just done nothing but cause them to be frustrated after 80 hours, right? So this is really about what does the leader need to do to make sure the system can improve as we think about literacy. This is not training for teachers. I want to be clear about that. Can teachers have access to it? Sure, I don't care. But it's not going to teach them how to teach phonics better. This is about how do leaders set up the systems and conditions. Okay? One more question.
Actually, Kate, I think you just answered my question.
Yeah.
When you know that this is working, the desired outcome, is it knowledge dissemination, or is it implementation, or both?
Really good question. Our intent with these materials is knowledge dissemination. How will I know if it's working? I think when we answer Matt's question. I think when we as a state have the knowledge and we can advocate for the policies, practices, and resources that need to happen, that's how we'll know if we've had an impact from the university and from the partnership. Does that make sense? Yeah, now you're going to want to know, how do I measure that? I don't know, I got $17.6 billion on the table, so I feel like, we can get after it a little bit, maybe. Any other questions about the resources or how we're going to go about that? Okay. They're free. That's really where I got the service co-op directors. They're like, wait a second, so it's free? I'm like, it's free. And we will have a process for how people can earn CEUs. We imagine that it's about 25 hours? Like 25 hours, I think, somewhere in that neighborhood is what the CEUs would be for. So, okay. I want to thank our panelists again for being with us today. And last but not least, I want to wish you all luck finding your car. And if anyone wants some extra help, we do have President Emeritus Rob Brunix in the audience, who's very good at navigating the parking structure. All right, thanks everyone for coming.